What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Tranq. I'm super excited. Today I'm going to be finally finishing that side table I started a few weeks ago. If you missed part one of the series, I'll leave a link in the corner here where you can check it out. But I'm really excited to show you guys how it turned out, so let's go ahead and jump into the video. Okay, so after talking with my friend that I was making this table for, she decided on a design for the base that I also thought was really cool, but I also knew was going to be somewhat challenging due to the tapers in the design, and so you'll see that as the video progresses. But anyway, I made some plans for it, drew it up in Fusion 360, and really had to take a few minutes to think, how do I even start this project? So I'm using sapele for the main wood here, as I thought it would be a nice contrast with the top, which you'll see at the end. The first step was to just start breaking down this piece roughly into oversized sections so that I could start the milling process. I start off with the hand plane, just flattening one face. Again, you can use a jointer. I only have a 6-inch jointer, but I find it easier to use a hand plane to get rid of the major twist and things in these pieces, and then just use it to run through the planer and get the opposite face parallel. You can also just skip plane the piece in the planer to get both sides pretty flat, and I'm sure you'll get good results with that as well. Now, before going to the table saw, I go ahead and get a straight and perpendicular edge here. And then I carefully mark off just a few thousandths over 1.5 inches, which is going to be the width used for all of the legs and top and bottom of this table base. So using that marking line to carefully line up with the tooth of the blade, I can then set the rip fence and just rip all these down to just over 1.5 inches. Again, if you haven't seen, I just recently got this SawStop table saw, and I am absolutely thrilled to be using it. It's a pleasure to use and a huge upgrade over my job site saw. Okay, with those ripped out, I could then work on just smoothing that face to get rid of any tool marks, and this is why I let it just oversize of 1.5 inches. That way I could have a few thousandths to work with the hand plane, and I just took off the tool marks and dialed them in to be exactly 1.5 inches, double checking with the calipers each time. Okay, now I could start to progress towards the joinery here. So again, there's a 5-degree taper on these table legs, and so I set the blade to 85 degrees to give me that 5-degree taper, and then I use a miter gauge with a sacrificial fence to run through and get one side to have that taper. I'll have plans linked in the description where you can print them out, and if you want to build this, you can give it a try. Okay, so after carefully marking the opposing length that I need for these pieces, I again set up a stop block and just cut these pieces both the sides. These are the two cross frame members that will be on the top that will be joined with a half lap later on. So before cutting that half lap, I have to mark out the joinery for the finger joints. And this is where the design gets quite complicated, or deceivingly complicated, because instead of just 90-degree finger joints, which you could easily cut on a table saw or a router, they all have this 5-degree taper to them at various faces and edges, and so I decided to go ahead and cut this all by hand, and I started out with very careful layout of the joints. Quick tip is to always check that your pieces are sitting level in the vise. That's going to help reassure your ability to cut plumb. I'm using my dovetail saw for this, although it doesn't cater as well to these crosscuts, but it's the only saw I've got. Now, you'll see later I would have just started with the ripping cut, or the cut going into the end grain, but for some reason I started with the cross cut here. I'm not really sure why, but it would probably be smarter to start with this cut here. I'm using the Cosman saw, which is absolutely the best saw I've ever used. I've used the Lee Valley saw and others, and this one has a weight to it and a quality that is uncompared in saws. After getting those cut, I just clean up the inner corners with a chisel. I really like Rob Cosman's technique of the joints should fit straight from the saw, and so you shouldn't have to, chisel and pare down the actual joint after the fact, other than just cleaning up those inside corners. And this worked out for most of my joints. I did have to pair a couple just because I'm not perfect at sawing, but overall they turned out pretty well. Here I'm carefully marking out the half lap joints using the exact thickness obtained from the corresponding piece with the calipers. I could then bring this to the table saw and use the new crosscut sled to cut this out. I'm using a flat ground blade so that I get a nice even cut surface instead of those little ridges from a combination blade. If you missed the video on how to make this crosscut sled, I'll leave a link in the description and in the corner here where you can go check it out and make a dead accurate crosscut sled for your table saw. Now the half laps were just a little bit too tight to go together, and I did that intentionally so that I could come in and dial in the perfect fit with the hand plane. Essentially what I'm doing here is just shaving off a few thousandths at a time until those pieces just perfectly go together with a tight friction fit. And once I got that, I could go ahead and mallet the two pieces together. So you can see this is sort of the cross member that is the top of the table. There'll be a smaller version at the bottom and 4 legs that connect them. I just flush up the joinery again with the hand plane. I'm using the smoothing plane here. I'm borrowing the Lee Nielsen from one of my friends, and it's a really amazing hand plane. It's solid brass, has a ton of weight, and it's really enjoyable to use. So you can see here after some cleanup how accurate and how nicely those seams come together with 0 gaps in the joinery. Now because I've spent the time learning how to make my own dowels, I decided to make sapele dowels out of the same piece that the rest of the table base is made out of. To start that process, I ripped down some lumber of the same kind to approximately just over 1/4 of an inch. I then take off those hard corners using this little jig and the vise and a hand plane, and this will bring me down to sort of an octahedral shape and close to a 0.25 inch length in every dimension. I can then use the jig shown here to run it through with a hand drill and shave it down to a perfectly smooth and perfectly sized 1/4 inch dowel. If you guys want to see a video on how I set up and make these jigs, go ahead and leave a comment. It's something I'm thinking of doing and something you might find useful. I went ahead and made a few extras just so that I have them on hand in the future. If you see me in the shop, you know that I always love to use Isotunes audio, whether or not I'm listening to music, because even using them as earplugs, they're the best earplugs I've used. I've got a link in the description where you guys can get 10% off anything from their website, so be sure to check them out. I can then plug the holes for some dowel plugs here in the half lap, and I go ahead and just insert those, hammer them in, and then flush them with the flush cut saw. I use a low angle block plane here to just clean up the last little bit of the top of the dowels, and because of the low angle of attack on these planes, they make really easy work of this end grain, and it's a great way to flush up this joinery. So now it was on to making the 4 legs themselves, and this part is a little tricky because the dimension from the plans is something like 20.853 inches, which of course is nearly impossible to replicate perfectly. So I use my most accurate rule and get as close as I can to that length to start cutting these out. You can see here I've got a stop block on the rip fence in order to cut these all to the exact same dimension, which is debatably more important that they're all of the same dimension than they are the dimension in the plan. I then also cut off the 2 segments which will make the bottom cross member. So with those cut out, I could start transferring the joints onto the legs, and to do this I use a little setup block to make the 2 edges coplanar, and then I use a marking knife to carefully transfer those lines. It's best to take several light passes with the marking knife. It's going to ensure that things don't wobble and move around on you. I could then move on to cutting out the waist here, and this is where you have to be extremely careful. You have to be, as accurate as you can be with your sawing, and practicing really goes a long way with this. I'm still not perfect, but I am improving, and overall, you'll see at the end, I was pretty happy with my results. I'm using the new Concepts fret saw to take care of that waist, and it's by far the best fret saw on the market, so if you haven't used it and you do a lot of hand cut joinery, I'd highly recommend you pick one up. And because there's 4 legs and that has the waste taken out on 2 ends of each piece, there is actually 8 of these to cut out, which took a decent amount of time. The next step is very similar to getting rid of the waste when you're cutting dovetails, except now instead of chopping at 90 degrees, you're chopping at follow that 5-degree taper. So you have to be very careful here and sneak up to your gauge line and kind of follow that 5-degree taper as best as you can by hand. I like to use a holdfast to get these stationary in the table. A lot of people don't use one, but I do think it helps just to kind of keep things from moving around while you chisel. And with those chopped away, I can get rid of any little humps or anything in the middle that'll keep the joint from seating properly. And this is a really important step. I use a bevel gauge to check that the whole thing is at that 5-degree taper, because if any raised portions are in the center, your joints won't seat fully and you'll get a gap in the final result. And then I could go ahead and transfer these lines onto the bottom crossbeam members. And again, start cutting those out. So it's a lot of hand-cut joinery, so definitely a lot of sawing practice, and I could even tell from the start of the project to the end how much my sawing was improving. A little trick here to help you get 90-degree cuts on the across the grain side or cross-cut side is to indent that little ridge with your chisel, and that'll give your saw blade a little bit of a reference to keep you at 90 degrees and also to keep that shoulder line nice and clean and keep you from going over it. As usual, I clean up those inside edges with a chisel just because the saw doesn't perfectly take care of the waste on the inside corner of the joint. And with that, I could cut the corresponding half laps on those bottom crossbeam members, and this is pretty much the same process as I used on the top. I was not as careful apparently when I was doing this one because I got just the slightest gap, a couple thousandths of an inch in that half lap. Nothing that anybody else would notice, but given the quality that I was going for, I was upset that I didn't slow down on that step. I could then do a little dry fit to make sure things were going together, and I was super pleased to find that it did go together and that the piece was actually going together. So I'm going to be using figure-8 clips to attach the tabletop at the end, so before doing any glue up, I just put in a few little holes with a Forstner bit here to seat those figure-8 clips. And then it was on to glue up. Now this is a very clunky and awkward piece to try and glue and clamp. So the only way you can really go about it is just doing it all at once. So after a few close calls of the thing falling over, I could finally start to get the piece clamped and just pull all that joinery together and leave it to dry. So you can see here after glue up, it might look like your joints are terrible, but that's just because of the overlap between the joinery and dimensions. So after this is actually what I think is the most fun part, which is actually cleaning up the joinery, using a hand plane to flush up all those joints. And it's amazing after doing this, the difference you see in the before and after of those joints. All of a sudden they come together and you see very minimal gaps and very clean joinery. So this process was taken on every face of the project, and luckily there is usually some way to put the piece in the vise, even if it wasn't the most stable way. And this step is basically just going through and flushing everything up. It's very relaxing, very enjoyable, and it was fun to do. On some of those harder to reach areas, I used my little block plane to get in there and flush up the ridges. This was useful because the jack plane, of course, can't get into these tight corners. Now there's no way to get this underneath the drill press, so for the dowels on the bottom side here, I just drill them out by hand, trying to drill as straight as possible. You can see here I probably could have kept those at a little bit better of a 90-degree angle, but it's completely invisible to the eye. I then plug those again with the Sapele dowels and then flush them all with the flush trim saw. On these half lap joints, the block plane also comes in useful because it allows you to kind of pick up the plane as you're reaching those overlap points and keep you from tearing up the grain on the opposing piece. Then it will start to get prepped for finishing, and so I use a card scraper to clean up the areas where I could, kind of maneuver with the card scraper. And I use the block plane to put a chamfer on, doing about 10 strokes for every edge that I could reach. That's going to help soften it and keep those corners from breaking. And here you can see how everything looks after the cleanup. Now on those areas that I couldn't really reach with a hand plane or that just needed a little more softening, I use a 220 grit sanding block to come through and ease off all those areas. And before applying the finish, I go ahead and put my marker on the bottom, something that I've finally learned to do so that you can actually sand it clean before putting the finish on. Now I'm using Odie's oil for the finish. I'm pretty new to Odie's oil, but I've actually really enjoyed the results I get with it. It's an all-natural finish, so you can just kind of wipe it on with your hands, and like here with the white Scotch-Brite pad to help work it into the wood. And I only did one coat, and it ended up being what felt to be a pretty durable finish, at least for a table base, which isn't going to be getting a ton of abuse. Finally, I could go ahead and install the figure 8 clips, and these just consist of a little pilot hole and a countersunk screw, and I could go ahead and finish the piece, and here are the final shots. Alright, that's going to do it for today's video. I'm ecstatic with how this turned out. When I originally did this top a few weeks ago, I was super excited about it, but I didn't know if the base would be able to kind of hold up to how great the top turned out. But honestly, I think it perfectly complements it. It's sort of a simple, traditional, modern design, and I'm just super happy with it, and the joinery was definitely a challenge. So if you liked this, guys, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more videos. Leave a comment below what you thought, and leave this video a like. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.